This is Steve Brown, and welcome to another installment of my series, variously called Libertarian Heretic, Pragmatic Libertarianism, or just Sane Libertarianism. I'm Steve Brown, writer, anthropologist, and awesome dad. Okay, now, the first couple of episodes as we get along on this series here, I talked about the complexity of liberty. I talked about how my views on liberty, though I've been a libertarian for, oh my goodness, 40 odd years, and have made minor history in the history of the Libertarian Party by being the first to run for office in Oklahoma, that my notions began to change after the seminal point in my life when I moved to Poland and spent the next 13 years in Eastern Europe, and then came home and saw my own country through new eyes, and in particular because I became a government reporter in the rural areas of the Midwest, where I've sat in on many a city council and city commission meeting. So I want to tell you about how this affected something else, my reading tastes. Now, when I was a young libertarian, I loved reading these utopian speculations about how we'd all be free someday without government or whatever. I read Murray Rothbard's For a New Liberty, and I read David Friedman's David Friedman's book. Its name will come to me in a moment, but it's a good one. It's still a good one. I read a book still well beloved in some circles called The Market for Liberty by Morris and Linda Tannehill, and this even extended into my tastes for literature. I read the classics of science fiction. Of course, there's Robert Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, and Cyril Kornbluth's The Syndic, and going back, a great many people who advocate for a stateless society will have you read Njal's Saga, which was one of the gems of ancient Icelandic literature, then the days of the historical novels of the mighty founders, and in this one the story of a 50-year feud, which everybody talked about for centuries afterwards, but which, when you start total up the casualties, wait a minute, they were fighting for 50 years and like a few dozens of people got killed. At any rate, I enjoyed this kind of thing, and I still believe it has a purpose. I mean, it has, speculative fiction has a purpose in political science as well, such. But as I was living in Eastern Europe, and I was actually watching people rebuild societies. In a situation, I, as an American, of course, we look to our ancestors, whether our ancestors arrived then or not, but we look to the history of our own nation, and we see people expanding into a largely empty continent, with apologies to the Native Americans, but seriously speaking, and the population, then this is, at our founding, we were a population of 3 million scattered up and down the eastern seaboard. By the mid-19th century, we had reached a population of 40 million, which is one hell of an expansion, but still, compared to today, when we are something like 330 million, the place was pretty freaking empty. Now, different situation in Eastern Europe, though. We're talking about ancient civilizations in an area which had been populated, if not to its carrying capacity with the available food-producing technology, then pretty close to it. Oops, sorry, got a dog here. Hey, puppy, sit. But these are societies which had succumbed to the totalitarian temptation, or had it imposed on them, and had recently gotten over it, the collapse, the near collapse of their economies and such, which did a couple of things for me. Is that one is that for those who like to dabble in post-apocalyptic scenarios, that I found out exactly how far an advanced, complex society can get without actually how far it can fall without actually falling apart. And when I say how far, I mean when I got to Poland in 1991, the capital city was a grim, gray, filthy, and depressing place. That's where, thank you, Virginia Pastoral, where I learned to love neon. Neon at night actually made it attractive. As people became more secure in their property, they also started to care for the public places more. The towns, I lived in a town about 25 miles outside of Warsaw. There was a fairly affluent town full of nice houses, most of them owner-built, by the way, or old, or pre-communist, which still had dirt streets everywhere. In fact, people were actually a little resistant to the idea of paying them. Well, the average wait for a telephone was 14 years. Before you started to apply, I had a friend who had a file like this of his correspondence with the phone company. At the Liberation, what the town did was they founded their own telephone exchange. My telephone exchange in the town I lived in, by the way, is where I first experienced a party line. Party lines still existed when I was a child, but I had never had one, in which you had to call the operator. To the despair of my family, you had to call the operator and ask for a 3-digit number in Polish. After a while, I told my mom, Mom, this is a small town. Everybody knows everything by now. Just call this number and say, Pan Brown, and they'll connect us. The family I lived by the way, had quite illegally given their neighbor an extension to their phone, and the operator had a different pattern of rings depending on who you wanted to call. That's how they'd arrange things back then. At any rate, give you an idea how far things can fall without actually falling apart, as I said. For those of you who are anticipating the imminent economic apocalypse of the United States, after which we will march in triumph and be the only viable alternative. And so much for post-apocalyptic scenarios. The other thing that changed is my reading tastes. I think I mentioned that I found a copy of The Federalist, and though I may have been exposed to it earlier, probably forgot it line by line, now I found it immensely fascinating, and I promise you I am going to indulge in some political speculation of my own when I tell you how I think the example of Poland affected the framing of the Constitution in 3 ways. 3 specific ways. Although it is mentioned only about 3 times in the Federalist in a very offhand way, it served as an example of what not to do in framing the new Constitution. My taste changed because of this. The libertarian works, especially the ones with anarcho-capitalist men, were very, very heavy on this is the way it could work. This is the way it should work. This is the way it might work. Should, could, might. You know, the Tannehills, as I recall, it's been a while, but were very much, this is the way it could work, and they were very, very positive about this. Oh, well, you know, if we didn't have a government with politicians and scandals, then the news media would have to concentrate on exposing abuses by corporations or something like that. You know, that it would all work differently. You know, if we didn't have this big parasitic government sitting on our backs, then things would be so much nicer. Science would advance so much more rapidly. You know, that kind of thing. Great, maybe, should, could, would, might. You know, I no longer have quite as much interest. I mean, it's fun to think about over a beer with some friends or something, but don't tell me how it could work, should work, would work, or might work. Tell me how it works. That's how my reading taste changed. I wanted to hear from people who had something to do with creating or maintaining states. the Founding Fathers. I read Jefferson voraciously, Madison. I discovered Edmund Burke, Reflections on the Revolution in France. Now that is an unexpected gem. I expected to be bored out of my mind by it. Talk to me about Niccolo Machiavelli, for heaven's sake. Machiavelli, as I think Rousseau said, anybody but an ass could tell that Machiavelli was a friend of liberty, because nobody would have written about the uses of power in such nakedly honest terms. And read the end, Machiavelli's plea for liberty. It has actually motivated me to take a course via the great courses on Machiavelli, and someday I'm actually going to get around to reading the discourses. So that's it. That's how my taste changed. Tell me how it works. Show me how this, and don't make airy speculations about how it might work. Now, the disturbing thing about this among modern libertarians in the United States, not abroad, is how little interest there is in the pragmatics of liberty. It's how it should work, how little, you remember that I mentioned this, that the modern libertarian movement is theory heavy and experience light. Well, not only is it theory heavy and experience light, but there is often a rejection, a militant unwillingness to go out and get some of the experience. When libertarians run for office, those who do believe in running for office and working within the system, what do? They usually go for some high-level office. Like, well, I'm going to run for senator. Great, senator. What's your experience? What have you done? Or, God help us, run for president. With Ron Paul, for all his manifest faults, and I know there are people who would wish to shoot me for saying this, but at least, for heaven's sake, at least he's been in Congress. I think he's incredibly naive about anything beyond our borders, which I will get into later, which that naivete has a strong tendency to become pathology. But for heaven's sake, at least he's been in Congress. He knows how it works. Rand Paul, the same. And there are libertarians who have run for local office, but once you've gotten, once you've gotten there, then you're stuck with, no, what are we going to do now? What are we going to do? What am I going to do with this office to make life more free for my constituents? And how am I going to sell them on the idea that this is a good idea? Okay, we know some things. One could take a more liberal libertarian attitude towards victimless crimes and such. This has its own problems. Do not fool yourself or thinking that once victimless crimes are abolished that the problems end. There are problems which come with these things, which, again, experience. We might look at how the Netherlands does things. By the way, I've been there. It's a delightful place. Amsterdam, I mean. I'm told. I'm told I was there. So, in closing, I'd like to say, this is where this series is going. It's not about how things could work, would work, should work, might work. It's about how things work. We don't know how things work in X situation. Well, we're not going to BS. We may speculate, but we're not going to claim our speculations are fact. And with that, I think we'll say good day, have a nice day.